Morning, everybody. I have a little raspy throat because I'm getting over a cold. I want to thank NICHD for funding this research and also for the mentors that worked with me on this project. So, because we have such a short period of time, I'm going to jump right into the goals of this study. So our goal here was to build consensus amongst experts in basically the autism field and also those in childhood trauma regarding what do you think are actually kind of key indicators or symptoms of a traumatic reaction in kids on the spectrum. And just a little rationale for this, in contrast to most other psychiatric comorbidity, assessment of PTSD in people on the spectrum is quite rare in the research literature. And in most studies where this has been done, the rate of PTSD is actually quite low. So there's one exception to this, a study out of Turkey that found an increased rate of PTSD in people on the spectrum, but in general, reported rates are 0 to 3%, okay? Which is interesting and raises some questions given there are many reasons to think that individuals on the spectrum may be at risk for both experiencing potentially traumatic events and maybe struggling to also cope with those events. And so we were, wondering, are the diagnostic criteria really sensitive enough or appropriate enough for this population? And there's a bit of a precedent for this, so there are adjusted criteria for kids under 6 to basically to assess for PTSD in the DSM based on research that was done that showed that the existing criteria really wasn't sensitive enough to capture it in this population. So just some things to think about. And we use this Delphi approach. So Delphi was originally developed by the RAND Corporation in the 1950s to actually forecast how technology would influence warfare. But what it is it's a way to try and build consensus amongst people who you think might know something, who are in different locations, without having to actually sit them down in a room. And the process is basically you do a tailored survey, you ask for their opinions on the questions that you're asking, and then you send feedback back to everybody about what the group as a whole said, give them a summary of the conclusions of the group and the characteristics of the group, and ask them if they want to amend their answers, okay? So for this, we did a planned 2-round Delphi poll of 72 experts, and again, the autism field and childhood trauma field, and experts were defined as those with over 5 years of experience at least in autism or childhood trauma, and they needed to report some professional experience with somebody on the spectrum who had been exposed to a potentially traumatic event. The experts were asked to review 48 potential traumatic reactions that were derived from the literature, what little is there, and also a qualitative study that was done with adults on the spectrum about what's a trauma in your life and how do you think it impacted you, and also caregivers of a broader age and ability range of individuals on the spectrum. And the first round, they answered questions about themselves, so what's your level of expertise, and they also rated the importance of each one of these symptoms. So do you think this is a really important, critical indicator of potentially traumatic reaction or not? And remember, there's things we're thinking about there, right? That there are many overlapping symptoms between PTSD and autism, so we're asking the experts to consider what do you think is really useful to making your diagnostic. It could actually help you differentiate between these two things. What do you think is specific? What's truly important, okay? We also allowed them to suggest additional symptoms that weren't on the list. Okay. Then we sent them back a summary of all the mean ratings of the symptoms and also the characteristics of the sample and said, okay, now what do you think? All right. And so they're allowed to change their answers based on what other people said. I know it feels a little weird. It's not a classic quantitative. It's about building consensus, okay? And consensus we defined as basically do 75% or more experts think this is an important symptom. And just to give you a little background to see what the expert sample looked like, it was about 46% of people who said my expertise is really in autism, 25% childhood trauma, and 29% childhood trauma and autism, which I was actually surprised to hear. And 51% had over 15 years of experience in these areas, and the other 49% had about 5 to 10. Also, we had a mix of psychology, psychiatry, mental health, behavior analysis, social workers, so diverse backgrounds. 72% had worked with individuals who were nonverbal or had moderate intellectual disability, and 57% had worked with more than 10 youth with autism and some kind of trauma exposure or history. So round one, 10 symptoms emerged as kind of identified as an important symptom by consensus, and 3 additional symptoms were suggested, the child being less socially responsive, resisting forms of physical contact, and becoming more listless or sluggish. So we sent that back, and then in the second round, we actually had a final 22 symptoms were identified by consensus. So the consensus really worked. You saw a larger number of symptoms being brought to the fore. 7 symptoms were identified as basically having weak consensus, and 4 as limited importance. So basically, experts said, no, I don't think this symptom is going to tell us much. So I'm going to try and take us through these, again, fairly quickly and go through the DSM criterion. So criterion B in DSM is intrusion. And what you see here are kind of the classic intrusion symptoms. 4 of them made it to consensus. So people really agreed these are important. However, there was a little twist on some of them. So recurrent involuntary intrusive trauma memories that are expressed through perseverative talk, questioning, and play. Okay. Similarly, dissociative reactions and flashbacks made it onto this list, but this is one of the most divided items. So some people thought it's useful, other people said it's not useful because I don't think you could ever identify it. Okay. Criterion C is avoidance. These 2 made it to the top. Criterion D, this is negative alterations in mood and cognition. Again, a lot of the DSM criteria are here with one twist, increase in socially withdrawn behavior since the trauma. So the way the DSM is written, it's actually an increase in feelings of isolation or alienation. Experts actually thought the behavior, actual isolation, was more important, whereas the feeling of isolation was ranked about 65th. 65% thought that was also important. Criterion E, this is alterations in arousal and reactivity. These are all within the DSM, so you see a lot of them are endorsed in this category, and more were endorsed in this category than any other. But there was also 3 additional symptoms that really came to the fore, again, that are in our top 22 list, which is 3 varied forms of self-injurious behavior and suicidal ideation. Experts, the vast majority agreed that if this occurred in somebody on the spectrum, they would think it was a potential indicator of a traumatic reaction. So self-injurious behavior, an onset of suicidal ideation, and also non-suicidal self-injury they thought was important. And then here are the 3 other symptoms that made it to the top that are not technically in DSM criteria: excessive reliance on peers or adults for safety, excessive reassurance seeking, a reduced ability to complete previously mastered adaptive skills, so regression in adaptive skills, and also in communicative language. Experts really identified as important. And then here are the ones that were, basically there wasn't good consensus, or there was good consensus that they're not helpful. So the ones with mixed consensus, these are kind of the bottom of the list, were the worsening of certain types of autism symptoms. So if you saw an increase of sensory seeking behavior, atypical speech, experts really didn't agree that that would be convincing. Or the feeling of distrust or betrayal. This was interesting because this is actually something I've heard from adults on the spectrum in qualitative interviews is important. And then things with limited importance, compensatory acts, so all of a sudden the need to act like an adult or relieve other people's stress, or empathy deficits. And these types of symptoms were pulled from developmental trauma disorder research, so broader views of what traumatic stress might look like. So just an overview. Oh my God, 2 minutes. Hey, I'm doing good on time. There were many symptoms from the DSM criterion actually represented in this top 22 symptoms that were identified from the 2 groups, with some distinctions, which is that this idea of intrusive memories, it was important that they could potentially be expressed through repetitive or ritualistic play, speech, or questioning, and this idea of actually looking at the actual isolation or the social withdrawal of the child as opposed to just the feeling of alienation or isolation. There was also, these varied forms of suicidality and self-injury that people thought were quite important, and limited faith in difficulties remembering the trauma or extreme risk-taking as things that could be useful. So those are DSM symptoms. They did not make it to the top of our experts list. Other important behaviors were regression in communication and adaptive skills and excessive reassurance seeking. And then we saw that experts did feel that some behaviors will be less informative. Okay. And just limitations, this is expert consensus. So this is what I'm hoping to do to inform the quantitative empirical study, where we actually look at kids on the spectrum who've been exposed to traumatic events, and we are sure that we're hopefully asking the right questions and trying to do so in a sensitive way. But this itself is that study. But what it does tell you is we were actually able to establish good consensus from people in quite different fields about what are the things that might be important for us to look at here. And again, this might, and this is predominantly expert perspectives, although what they were looking at was actually informed from the literature and from qualitative interviews by those on the spectrum. So I think this will hopefully give us a guide to continuing research in this area. Thanks.
It's a really, really wonderful and important talk. Thank you.